Now this is, of course, English 295, Selected Topics in Literature. And there are various 295 courses. I teach two myself, Comparative Mythology and Myth and Monsters. But I want to ask you to consider, what is literature? Literature is defined differently by different people, which is a truism. But my curiosity led me to ask my Facebook friends, what is literature? Because I wanted to see what how various people would define this word. So far, only 4 of them have responded, but I'm going to read their responses, and then I want to talk about literature a little bit and how myth fits into this. One of my former students wrote on Facebook, literature is a story or written work of art with vast amounts of depth and many viable interpretations to be had regarding that particular piece. Now, this student just took English 180, not from me, but from another instructor, so this is fresh in his mind. Another one of my friends, who is not a former student, but who did attend OTC, said, it is a form of putting letters into words, can be fiction or nonfiction, books, poems, etc. Another friend of mine, at large, said, literature is what I read. And then a former student of mine wrote, literature, a composite of written words on a given topic. If fictional, it can tell the story of life, times, or events expounded upon by descriptive and interest-grabbing ideas. If factual, it should impart knowledge and understanding of the topic with proper documentation of sources, research, and proof of facts. So there we have 4 different interpretations that do have some of the same elements. All of them said written work, but they didn't touch on some of the things that dictionary.com says in its definition of literature. Now, I'm going to caution you now. Do not give me a dictionary definition in a paper or a project. And the reason why I say this is because most of the time when students do have a dictionary definition, it is unnecessary, and it is something that I already understand, and sometimes it's padding. But I'm going to read this definition of literature to you from dictionary.com for a purpose. And it says, the number 1 definition, there are others, but this is the one that applies to us. Writings in which expression and form in connection with ideas of permanent and universal interest are characteristic or essential features as poetry, novels, history, biography, and essays. Now, dictionary.com goes on to talk about the synonyms of literature. Bell's letters. Letters refer to artistic writings worthy of being remembered. In the broadest sense, literature includes any type of writings on any subject. The literature of medicine usually, however, means a body of, it usually means a body of artistic writing. Characterized by beauty of expression and form and by universality of intellectual and emotional appeal. So that definition is really rather snobbish in a way. And the reason why I want to talk about literature is because the snobbishness pervades academia and has pervaded the realm of literature overall for quite some time. Now, we have canons of literature, aka the literary canon. And these are writings that again go to that universal appeal that would people in various times would continue reading. Now, the literary canon has been in constant, I don't know if I want to say flux, but it has evolved over a period of time. And one of the first was the Harvard Great Works, and that was about 1909, in which some professors at Harvard got together and said, well, you know, these are the works that really are really important, and so we need to, encourage people to read these works. And, of course, that is the Western canon. There are other canons would be from other parts of the world. Now, the problem with the early canon and it would have included Shakespeare, Homer, writers from the 18th and 19th centuries, and then of course on into the 20th century, was that by and large they were old white men. The canon, the literary canon, was a club for old white men. And I say old because young and up and young coming, they weren't classic enough, they weren't around long enough to have their works really considered. Why I say white men? Because people of color and women were not included in the early canons. And then in the 1960s, there was a shift, and whoever assembled the literary canon and who decided what would be in it were accused of being racist and anti-feminist. And we saw a shift. And women and people of color then started being added to the canon. And so we get down to English 295 in this year, and I want to use this next year and the year after, I hope, this video, but so I'm not going to name the year. Oh, wait, it says 2013 down there in the corner of this video screen. So we come down to the 21st century and the canon and literature as a whole. Now, you will notice that in just about all the definitions that I read, it said written works. First of all, I think this needs to change because we consider drama as a part of the literary canon and definitely a genre of literature. Drama is meant to be seen on the stage, but it's written down before, obviously in a script before it is performed. If we accept drama as a part of the literary canon and a genre of literature as a whole, then we must accept TV shows and movies as literature. I'm even going to carry this a step further. Within literature, you have, as I said, you have genres and you have subgenres. And so you have mythology, fairy tales, legends, folk tales. These tales, some of them have more in common than others. For example, fairy tales and myth have to do with the fantastical. But a really strong correlation between all of these stories is the fact that at one time they were oral, as was all literature oral at one time. Before there was a canon, before there was writing, there was a whole corpus of literature that was repeated orally. And so I would add to the definition of literature not only written works, but spoken works as well. Traditions that have been passed down word for word, well, I shouldn't say word for word, but from generation to generation through oral transmission. Now, a lot of these have been written down, but again, they were originally spoken aloud. So I would include within the realm of literature oral traditions. Now, the problem with oral traditions is that they tend to dribble out over time, and when the last person who knows that story dies with that person. Writing it down doesn't necessarily ensure longevity over many centuries, and I will use Beowulf as an example. We have one extant copy of Beowulf from the Anglo-Saxon. We didn't know it existed until I think it was the 18th century. It might have been the 17th, but I think it was the 18th century. So until that time, we didn't know that a character named Beowulf existed, and we didn't know all of his adventures and what he went through during his life. So unfortunately, many written forms of literature have fallen by the wayside as well. We have scripts that we are not able to translate as yet. Hopefully someday in the future we will, including the Etruscans and Linear A in Crete and some others as well. We have been able to crack some writing. We can read Mayan writing now, whereas when I was a girl, we didn't know what it said. And of course, we've been able to decipher Egyptian hieroglyphs and Sumerian cuneiform for quite some decades now. And we're able to peruse their literature and have an understanding of it. So, literature, when we examine these definitions of literature, and I'm going to go back to that snobbishness. The classics are considered classics because They have withstood the test of time. And now they have become associated with a certain style of writing. So in the 20th century, well, in the 19th century as well, you had writers who kind of fell by the wayside. They might have been very popular at the time, but they kind of fell by the wayside, and their popularity didn't last. We wouldn't consider those classics. But I think, in my semi-expert opinion, that now we have genres of writing and we have authors that we are going to make us re-examine how to define classic. One of the things that was mentioned in the dictionary.com definition and other definitions that I have seen is the universality of these forms of literature. And that means they speak to people in the 18th century and they still speak to people in the 21st century. So let's look at Stephen King, an extremely popular and prolific writer of the 20th and the 21st century. Now, Stephen King isn't in the canon. Will he be in 100 years? Well, unfortunately, I won't be around long enough to know that. But if we are talking about the universality, Stephen King's books will be read for a very long time. The Librarian Association of America voted James Joyce's novel Ulysses as the best novel of the 20th century. How many of you have read Ulysses by James Joyce? I tried, and I couldn't get through it. It's stream of consciousness, and I found it very difficult to read and understand. And as an English teacher, I shouldn't say this, it wasn't worth the effort. In 100 years, the only people who are still going to be reading James Joyce's Ulysses, I predict, will be librarians and English professors. The general public already doesn't read this book, but yet it is a classic. It's going to be on the canon. So where is the universality? On the other hand, Stephen King. He appeals to a broad spectrum of people, including me, even though I don't like so many of his later novels. So should Stephen King be included in the canon? Some people would say that Stephen King's work isn't literature because of its genre. It has to do with horror, and because it is, and well, no, I'm going to take that back, because we would probably put Poe and some other writers who wrote horror into the canon, but not Stephen King. The thing is about Stephen King, he hasn't withstood the test of time. Examine Shakespeare. Shakespeare was extremely popular during his time, not only with the upper echelon, but with the common folk. Going to a different genre altogether, opera. Opera was considered very lowbrow, and it wasn't until opera had been around for a while that the well-to-do and educated people got hooked on it. Now we associate opera with the upper class and the well-to-do and the snobs. I like some opera, and opera has also changed. There's rock opera and other types of opera and different genres of music. This is a mythology class. So how does myth fit into this aspect or this definition of literature? And it is a genre of literature. Well, first of all myth was oral before it was recorded, written down. And there is a lesson in the first module on how we know about mythology and the functions of myth. In Hesiod, in Greece, Homer, whether or not Homer even existed, he wouldn't have been writing down his work because he was blind, so somebody would have recorded it for him. But nevertheless, Homer is often cited, and the playwrights, we're going to read Oedipus, the playwrights of Greece were at the forefront of preserving these myths. Now, in other countries, it was different. For example, in Egypt, no one in Egypt sat down one day and said, by golly, I think I better write down the mythology of Egypt because so other people can read it. What we know about the mythology of Egypt is from coffin texts, pyramid texts, and the book of Coming Forth by Day, which is also known as the Book of the Dead. Also, was it Herodotus? Excuse me, the name of the Greek escapes me, but I'm pretty sure it was Herodotus, visited Egypt, and he wrote down some of these myths. But we get them from the perspective of a foreigner and the perspective of these myths have been around for thousands of years by this time. How much have they changed? This is getting really long. I'm going to stop and I'm going to pick up in the next sequence.